Hello everyone. For today's media project, I'm going to be talking about History Lesson, which is by the author Jeanette Armstrong. The central idea of the poem History Lesson by Jeanette Armstrong are the mistreatment of indigenous people at the hands of European colonizers, the loss of indigenous cultures and tradition for the purpose of assimilating to the European way, and finally, the loss of indigenous land to European colonizers and settlers. Armstrong uses various literary devices to express her central ideas. For example, in describing how poorly indigenous people were treated, Armstrong says that they stand shaking fists, waiting to mutilate whole civilizations 10 generations at a blow. This is an example of metaphor, hyperbole, and diction. The lines stand shaking fists and waiting to mutilate whole civilizations 10 generations at a blow are metaphors because they weren't necessarily literally shaking their fists, and it isn't possible to take out 10 generations at a blow at one time. But the impact of their behavior is being compared to these things. The reference to this shaking fist is a reflection to their aggression, and the reference to taking out the whole civilization 10 generations at a blow refers to the culture the colonizers took away, impacting many generations into the future. The line 10 generations at a blow is also an example of hyperbole because it is exaggerated beyond what is literally possible in order to get across the impact of the situation. Another example of the use of literary devices is found in the lines Father Meanwell waves his makeshift wand, forgive saucer-eyed Indians. Nobody is literally holding a wand, but it is a metaphor for the power the European holds over the indigenous people. Armstrong also makes use of tone to show sarcasm and anger. In the line, civilization has reached the promised lands, Armstrong uses a metaphor, the promised lands, to get her point across that the Europeans saw the land of the indigenous people as something they were entitled to. Also, in the line Green Paper Faces of a Smiling English Lady, Armstrong might be using the literary device of tone to show a sarcastic attitude. The Queen of England has a smiling face on a $20 bill, while the indigenous people are having so much taken away from them. Armstrong uses the line, while burying breathing forests and fields beneath concrete and steel, and this gives an example of how the traditional land of the indigenous people was taken over and changed by the Europeans. The use of alliteration in two places helped to emphasize this feeling. Another quote that describes the impact on indigenous land is, for the power glimpsed in a garden, forever closed, forever lost, using the device of allusion. This expresses the feeling that the land will never return to its original state. The poem connects to the TRC calls to action and UNDRIP because it highlights the pain and loss that the TRC is called to help heal. It expresses the terrible ways that indigenous people were treated and makes it clear that these were horrible things that needed to be prevented from happening again. Poems such as History Lesson are an important part of describing and giving information about the things that UNDRIP has a goal of helping with, such as reconciliation, healing, peace, cooperation, justice, democracy, and respect for human rights. Now, a little bit about the author Jeanette Armstrong. The author of the poem History Lesson by Jeanette Armstrong was born on the Penticton Indian Reserve in Okanagan Valley, British Columbia. She lived there most of her life and raised her family there. She has been studying traditional Okanagan teachings for many years. She received a traditional education from her family and the elders of her nation. She has a history of communicating about Indigenous issues through her roles as an author, an artist, an educator, as well as an activist. In fact, she was appointed Canada's Research Chair in Okanagan Indigenous Knowledge and Philosophy. One of the main experiences that may have helped shape the poem History Lesson could have been the fact that, as well as her traditional Indigenous education, she also received a formal education at one-room school and may have learned about the contrast between traditional ways of learning and what's the mainstream white people's education focused on. Armstrong also would have seen and heard about the differences between her nation's life of the past versus the way things have been since colonization. Therefore, we conclude that History Lesson shows a great impact on how the Indigenous people were treated, according to the TRC calls to action, and UNDRIP also specifies the following things that the Indigenous people have been going through.